Welcome back to the Practical Performance Podcast, and you've got myself, Kate, Nick Baldwin and Joe Skipper, the VALERE team, and today we have our first ever guest on the podcast, and we're really excited to welcome Dr. Glen Deakin, who is very well established in the endurance field of research. So Glen has, and he can correct me on this because I'm probably going to completely undersell him, but over 53 publications in research looking at all things, including strength and conditioning, heat training, cooling, everything that you can think of in endurance athletes. He's a keen Ironman athlete himself. He's raced Kona. He's done, Glen, you can correct me, but is it over 20 Ironmans, 12 Ironmans? I know you got a legacy spot, so there's at least 12 in there. How many Ironmans have you done, Glen?
Okay, so I've done 30 Ironmans at the one location, which is the Australian Ironman in Port Macquarie, Foster. And then I've done additional Ironmans in Cairns and also the one in Kona. So, yeah.
There you go. So, yes, just a few Ironmans under his belt. Glen has also co-invented a cooling vest, and he is an expert in all things when it comes to heat training in particular. He lives in very sunny, hot, humid Cairns, so he is very used to the heat and humidity himself, and he's worked with multiple national Olympic level endurance athletes, triathletes, swimmers. He's just a very, very experienced leader in this field, so we're very lucky to have him on as our first guest. And today we're going to be talking about all things heat and altitude. In particular, we're going to talk about the pros and cons of each of those. So thank you very much for coming on our podcast, Glen.
You're welcome.
Excellent. Well, I wanted to kickstart us off really simple, just by asking you, Glen, if you could summarize and in fairly simple terms, the benefits of what you would get from training in the heat and a little bit about benefits of what you would get from training at altitude and how those two things differ for athletes.
Okay, I can give very simple and practical terms. I'll start with altitude first because a lot of people are aware of what altitude training is the best way to think about it is altitude training typically causes a situation where we have an increase in red blood cell volume, okay, without going into all the physiology behind it, but we have an increase in red blood cell volume, which allows us then to carry more oxygen in the blood because we have an increase in hemoglobin mass. By increasing more oxygen in the blood, it allows us to actually then extract more oxygen when we're doing exercise. And theoretically, if we're doing that, we have an increase in VO2 max. So a lot of athletes then will go to altitude with the benefit of, well, I want an increase in VO2 max to increase my performance. On the flip side, you've got heat. The heat doesn't do that. It actually works on increasing what's known as plasma volume, which has nothing to do with red blood cells. So it's the idea of what carries red blood cells around the body. So the plasma volume itself increases. And in theory, what typically happens then is it increases stroke volume. By increasing stroke volume, it means you're increasing the amount of blood that's being pumped. Then the idea is that you then can have an impact on VO2 max. So the idea is that by doing that, you could increase performance. There's definitely a lot of evidence for altitude to increase performance in VO2 max. But in terms of increasing performance from a heat perspective via VO2 max, the evidence is a little bit up and down. So there are some evidence to say yes, it does, and others to say no, it doesn't. But in terms of its improvement in performance, it's quite often due to other thermoregulatory factors, not necessarily just improvements in VO2 max.
Okay, good.
Glen, sorry. I was just going to say, people have said that, like, they have the same benefits. Like, if you can't go altitude, they say, like, get hot. Would you say that that's, like, not as effective then for endurance, like, in terms of improving performance if you're not in, like, a hot environment? Like, say if I couldn't go to altitude and I went and tried to, do a heat training protocol, would you say that would be less effective unless I'm racing in, like, a warmer race?
Okay. As I say to all athletes who ask me that exact question is I always go back to where the race will be. So the idea is if you're racing at sea level and it's not in a hot environment, then if you do a lot of heat training, then you're going to get all these thermoregulatory responses. You're not going to get a benefit going into, say, a temperate or a colder climate. So, for example, when I race going down south and I go down to Melbourne, say, where I am, it's 3,500 kilometers away. If I'm not racing in the middle of summer, when it's really hot down there, then I don't find that I'm kind of like performing at my best, because what happens quite often is I'm racing in cooler climate, so I'm actually not feeling warmed up at any one stage. Whereas if I'm trying to hope that I'm going to get an improvement in performance, I've got to weigh up, okay, is my improvement in performance going to be due to the fact I've acclimatized to the heat, or I'm going to be impacted by the cooler climate? So what I suggest to people is you've got to look at the temperature you're going to be racing in. If you're racing in a temperate climate, then you probably find, yes, you might get some benefit from the heat, but if it's bordering on cool, then I would dare say that the benefit you're going to get from the heat is going to be minimal. Okay. Then the other side, flip side is, yes, the altitude, you'll definitely see an improvement, but the problem you have with altitude quite often is it takes longer to get those adaptations than it does with heat. Heat adaptations come quite quickly. So within 4 to 6 days, you can have notable changes in adaptations, but altitude's a little bit longer in terms of getting those adaptations.
Glenn, do you have like a line in the sand where you define what would be a cool climate or cool conditions, and then what would be a warmer climate and warmer conditions, and therefore when you might want to be introducing your heat protocol? Say, for example, I'm thinking that, say, 20 degrees Celsius, would that warrant a heat training protocol beforehand, or would that still be what you'd refer to as cool?
Okay, that question is not as simple as you might think. The reason I say that, I'll give this example. From people that are born and bred in Cairns, for example, where the temperature during winter very rarely goes below 20 degrees during the day. Okay, so overnight it might go down to 12 or 13, 14 degrees, but during the day it rarely ever goes below 20. So if you get those sort of people going down to do a race in 20 degrees as a top temperature, they would actually think that is cold, right? They'll literally, I'm not joking, in summer up here, when the temperature gets to 25, 26 degrees, people go, oh, it's a little bit cool today. And people are going, that are from down south that have moved up here going, oh, it's so hot up here. But the problem is where you've come from is to determine how your adaptations are taking place. So those people that have adapted to their environment here, like I've been here for 20 years, I've adapted well and truly. I go down south and people say it's really hot down here. I'm going, you have no idea what heat is.
Come to England. I'll show them hot. come to Norwich. We get to 20 degrees once a year.
Yeah, so hence the reason, if you're from a cold climate and you go to compete in 20, where you've been used to, say, if you're in New Zealand, for example, and you're down on the South Island and your top temperature for most of the year is 10 degrees, you compete in 20 degrees, you're going to think it's quite hot. But in reality, compared to me, I'd be going, well, I wouldn't really worry about even acclimatizing to 20 degrees for heat because it's just not hot enough. So what I'm trying to say, it's all relative to where you come from as to whether you do heat training or you don't do heat training and why. So hence the reason when people say, should I do heat training? I always say, where are you competing and where are you coming from? So if you're competing in a temperature, it's the same as what you are in terms of apparent temperature, okay, then the idea is you don't have to change anything. So because you're not going to necessarily get a benefit from doing all this heat training, because the idea is the temperature you're going to compete in is going to be much the same as what you're used to. Yes, you're going to put your body under stress, but to what benefit? Yes, you might get an increase in plasma volume and you might get an improvement in VO2 max. I say might, but if you're doing really good quality training, then the idea is you might have reached your ceiling anyway. It's not going to improve. And your performance enhancements that you'd get if you're going to compete in a hot environment, from acclimatizing to heat, you might not see because it's a temperate climate. So you've got to weigh up really where you're coming from and where you're competing at. So I can Glenn, say this, if you're going to a temperature that you're not used to, that is warmer than what you compete in, or what you train in, but you're going to compete in it, then you definitely will benefit from doing heat type of acclimation protocols.
This is not really music to my ears right now, because I'm telling myself all the time training in Seychelles is going to be so good for Dubai. Nope.
It's actually really interesting though, because last week, Nick, we spoke, didn't we? And you said when you went back to England and you did a few sessions, and I was like, did it feel a lot easier? You were actually like, it didn't actually feel as easy as what I thought. And we thought, didn't we, when we were talking to each other, oh, that's a bit strange. Like maybe it was to do with like the muscles weren't getting the load in the heat because you weren't able to do it. But maybe that's unfortunately you might not get the gains that you're looking for. You might just be suffering in the Seychelles, mate. Like, but at least you've got the features.
Yeah, so a lot of the other thing is too, a lot of people quite often, how would you say? I said they use heat because it's a lot cheaper to go to a hot environment, particularly here in Australia. It's easy to get to heat, whereas they say, okay, it's hard to get to altitude unless you're going to have your own unit that you can set up and train for. But quite often what they do then, they misinterpret its use. So you still have got to put the hard yards into your basic training. So you still got to be doing your long rides, still got to be doing your long runs, and still got to be doing your high intensity work. And some people try to shortchange their training. And the reason why they don't get any benefits when they do go is it's trying to make it, they might have actually done less training using the heat or the altitude to make up for the shortfall, thinking, oh, this will give me a magical pill. It doesn't work that way either, so your performance won't improve. It should be the icing on the cake that you use to give you that little boost for the environment you go to. So you do all your training like normal, but then you add on, okay, I've got to go compete in Kona, for example. So, for example, when I went from here to Kona, I didn't think the temperature was that different. Don't get me wrong. When you get out in the lava fields, you notice it, but it's a dry heat. But then you're going to lead, you drive, you run along a G drive, you go, whoa, this is hot. But it's tolerable if you're from a warm environment like Cairns. But someone that I was over there competing with, they were from Victoria and Melbourne and Wagga in South Australia. They were suffering, even though they were there 10 days early, but they just didn't have enough time to adapt to their environment. So they needed a heat protocol. Even if they had done all their training, they really needed a heat protocol on top.
Glenn, talking about Kona, like in the build up to it, I saw a lot of British athletes that were like training in like tents, doing like some runs on like a treadmill, like they'd make like a hot box kind of thing, like to train in. And would this have been beneficial, or would this have just added over, like stressed their body more, like for the sake of it, without actually providing a heat stimulus? Like, what does it work, or is that like it looks good on social media, but it's not actually going to get you the gains?
Okay, it does work. It's not just for the looks. However, there's a couple of criteria. You've got to make sure that you raise body temperature first and foremost, and increase sweat. So if you come out of a heat session and you go, I don't feel as if I've been sweating that much and it didn't get that hot, then it's ineffective. So the idea is you need to raise body temperature and you need to increase your sweat rate. So once you've done that, okay, you're getting some benefit. But the other thing is too, you need to gradually build up over a period of time. So it's not going to just come from 3 or 4 days of doing, sweat, in a box or a tent and then go to Kona. It's probably going to take a matter of weeks to build up. Because generally speaking, we try to get people up to say 90 minutes to 2 hours of doing a heat protocol as their finish line. Okay, that's what you want to build up to. But obviously, you don't want to start there. If you suddenly went from, a 10-degree cycling outside to suddenly put yourself into a 40-degree temperature and started cycling for 2 hours, you wouldn't make it to the end of the 2 hours. So you've got to build up over a period of time. So what you want to do is you're going to add a lot more stress to your training environment. You've got to reduce some of your load down to account for the fact that you're going to add this big amount of stress each week in little chunks and gradually increase it over time as the body starts to adapt to it. So it's a bit of a trade-off. Realize, say you're going to do 6 weeks of it. Over a 6-week period, you're going to slot in, okay, I'm going to do 30 minutes today, 30 minutes another 2 days, another 30 minutes after that, and then slowly but surely increase the duration, the intensity, and so forth. It just takes time.
What about then, Glenn, in the same thought process of what Joe's saying, like you can do the simulated heat sessions, which we see a lot of. What about like the altitude tents? For example, just before Nick and I got married, Nick thought it was a really good idea to get one of those altitude tent things that go over you when you sleep. So I was like, do you know what? I'm training a lot. I'm going to benefit from this too. Like, yeah, let's do it. He orders it, sets it up in the room, and it's literally just over his head. So he's literally just sort of over his head. So I'm on the outside. He can't hear anything because he's in it. All I get is the freaking engine thing going, brr, brr, and then something to air in and out. It's going, and so I'm on the outside getting shoved out by this box. And I was like, you better perform well. This better work. Would have it worked, Glenn? Is that helpful?
Before we get the answers to that, I've got an altitude tent as well, and Laura kicked me out and made me sleep in the spare room if I'm using that. Like, she's like, if you're staying in that, I'm not staying that with you. So I had one dog with me. We've got two dogs. The one dog was staying in the tent with me. So he might have been getting the games. I don't know. Did it work or not? He won a park run for a 5K. So he was going all right after it.
I had to stick it out, Joe. I stayed in bed. I was like, this is not romantic. And it was like the few months before we got married. Maybe it was even just after. I was like, this is not cool. And I don't, no offense, but I don't think you did well in that
I
race.
didn't have a good race. No, yes, no.
So after that, I was like, you were not getting that 10 together.
So again, it's a case of it takes a while to get used to the altitude training. And then also what altitude you put it at, how long you did it for, how long before. Like I said, if your training has not got to the point of where it needs to be, and then you put your altitude on top, then you're underdoing your performance when you get to your race. So you got to think about this as kind of like the icing on the cake in that last, phase with preparation for a race. Okay, I've done all my hard yards, but now I've got to think about, okay, what's the race condition? So if you're getting ready for Kona, okay, you've still done all your longer rides, all the preparation way back when, general prep, Pacific prep, getting race, but now you think, okay, what can I do to boost what might be lacking a little bit? I've maximum out, but I can just get a little bit more of this, a little bit more of that. And that's where altitude and the heat come in, but you've got to be able to be very regimental with your protocols. So for example, I'll just diverse for a sec from the altitude to the heat, is when you do heat, you've got to do every day to a certain degree, but the problem you have is, you can miss a day here and miss a day there, but what you have is people go, I'm going to train in the heat every day. Well, the way of getting around that is you use passive. So the idea is you can do some training outside just like normal, and when you come home, you might say, well, I'm going to sit in a warm room to keep the heat going for another half an hour while I do stretches or whatever. So the idea is I'm still sweating and getting used to it. So you're still getting a heat stimulus, but you're not having to sweat it out outside. So these sorts of ways and little tricks. So the same thing can happen when you're doing altitude. It's a case of, because we know that, living high but training low is the way to go. But the idea is, you've got to think about your environment. Can you live like that every day with your other half kicking you out?
Are there studies that actually show us beneficial? Because before I brought mine, it was so hard to actually find decent stuff. Like I saw some stuff where some people had said, it actually works. And then I saw other stuff that said, no, it didn't actually make an improvement. But do you know of any that actually did work? And if so, how long did they actually have to spend in it? Is it 8 hours, or is it more like 12, 13 hours a day you'd need to spend in it?
Okay. I got to be very careful, because the problem we have, research is extremely diverse. So I can tell you now up front, there's studies that have shown that altitude works. There's also studies that have shown that altitude hasn't changed performance. But one of the things that changes with all the research that is done is that everyone is trying to change one variable at a time. This variable have changed, whether it be the length of time, how far they went up in altitude versus someone went up, 3,000 meters, others living at 2,000, others are doing training and they're for 2 hours or 3 hours or 6 hours or 12 hours. The problem we have is that there's so many variables that are changing in every study that what happens is when you get to the end, it's like, okay, one person found an improvement. Okay, but their improvement comes from the fact they did every second day and they did for 8 hours and so forth. And what happens is the next study comes along and says, okay, well, they did that. We're going to change this variable, this variable, and this variable, and they will do something different and didn't find anything. Next one comes on and changes all those variables again. And so what can happen is you end up with this mixed match of information. So that's why we get this diversity of some studies finding information, some studies finding no information, and people like you and me going, which one do we follow? So hence the other thing is you add to all this, which gets complicated, we're all different. So you come from a different training background than me and Nick and whatever. So the idea then is it's a case, as I say to all my athletes, you have to do a trial and error, and you do it not before the major race you want to do it in, but the ones that you're practicing, as a practice race. You figure out, okay, what have you done previously and you didn't think it worked, then change something yourself, do your own little study and go, okay, they've told me I should be doing X, Y, or Z. I'll try that, see how it goes. Try it again. If you think it worked, try a little bit different to see if you can get a bigger benefit. If it didn't work, then you bring it back. So it could take 2 or 3 years to fine tune what it works for you versus what the literature says. Because I can tell you now, what's written in a textbook is an average quite often of various studies, and it's not necessarily applicable to you. Hence the reason I'm not going to say do this or do that, because it doesn't work that way. Because I've got umpteen different protocols for different people.
That's very helpful. I had a question, Glenn. Is it more the heat that creates these adaptations or humidity? So if athletes were trying to reproduce some of these adaptations in their training, whether they go to an environment with this or whether they're trying to create these adaptations at home, are they aiming to create dry heat, or do they need humidity in there? What actually really creates that stimulus?
That's a very good question. Again, I would definitely look at it first and foremost, look at it from the perspective of where you're going. Is it a dry heat or a humid heat? So, for example, when you go to Kona, you've got a mixture of both. Lava fields are dry, and the lead drive and an RV and so forth are humid. But you'll find most people notice humidity more than high temperature. Like when the temperature, if you go to the outback and the temperature is 40 degrees, you can feel as if you can still do something, because even though it's hot, you just notice it when you're in the sun. But when you're in the shade, you go, I can still function. We also know that there's a bit of a transfer effect. Even though it's been limited research on that, we do know that if you work in one, you can get some transfer effect to the other environment. But my suggestion would be is probably better to go for humidity increasing than just using temperature, because it's very hard to replicate temperature. Most environments will have humidity involved. So if you get a chance, say, you're getting ready to go to Kona and come up to Cairns, you'll find right now, for example, like it's only a few weeks away from Kona finishing, is our environment is not that different to what it is in Kona. Okay. Humidity is already at 60%. Okay, we have high, like right now we've got 32-degree days. Guess what it is in Kona? 32 degrees. So your situation is very much a combination of temperature and humidity. So I'd go temperature and humidity, not just dry, but the temperature and humidity mixture.
Okay, and if an athlete was going to go to the extremes of training in the heat and the humidity, would something like your ice vest or doing a pre-cooling protocol, would that blunt some of the adaptations from training in the heat? And I know they're very different because, for example, here with Nick and I, like we live in these temperatures, so we don't necessarily need to do all these specific sessions in the heat because we're exposed to it all the time. So we're getting these adaptations, but we almost need to have, like what Joe's touched on, those sessions where we do hit that intensity and where we do need to try and still work on some similar kind of pace stuff to what we want to do on race day. So in our instance, it's like, oh, okay, we would want to do some form of pre-cooling protocol or a vest or something to help us be able to handle the heat better. But in an instance where someone's after specific adaptations, would you say to them, don't do a pre-cooling thing or don't have a vest? What's your kind of thoughts on that, Glenn?
Okay. The problem you have, everyone handles heat differently. Some people can't tolerate heat very well at all. You need to figure it out for yourself as an athlete or coaches. You need to figure out whether you can or can't handle heat. And hence the reason why when you start off, don't go bull at a gate. You start off by working with a temperature that's just a little bit above what you're normally used to, and short, sharp, and see how it goes and just how well you go, and then gradually increase from there. When you get to a point where you feel as if, oh, this is really knocking me around, so to give you an idea, if you do a 6-hour ride in heat and you do a 6-hour ride in a very cool temperature, the physiological stress on the body is totally different. It will take you a lot longer to recover from the heat. It can take you hours and hours, even 24 hours before you start feeling normal again. So when you get to the heat, quite often, if you want to, like if you're getting ready for an Ironman, you want to do a run in the afternoon, you did a 6-hour ride in the morning, your run in the afternoon is going to be subpar. So what you need to do is really think about recovery. So don't worry, your body will definitely have felt the stress from being out there for the length of time. But if you want to be able to go out and go for another training session, you need to speed up recovery. So yes, you put some cooling on after you've come back. You might think, I'm going to blunt down the response. But because you're doing this type of training on a regular basis, like nearly daily, then the idea is the adaptations will still be there. What's more important is your health and ability to recover to do your next session. Otherwise, what happens is you end up carrying a lot of fatigue with you, and you feel really flat all the time and dehydrated because you can't drink enough because you've got excessive heat load that's still present in the body. So I always suggest to my athletes, if you want to put in a good quality session that afternoon or the next day, then cool down as quickly as you can.
Cool. That makes perfect sense. And I'm sorry, I'm hijacking the questions. I'm going to stop asking after this and give Joe and Nick a turn. But there was just something that you said that made me really want to ask you this. And you won't be surprised, Glenn, that I'm going to ask you this question. But do you notice in also just your experience, as well as if there's anything that it does exist in the literature about whether being a male or female influences the ability to tolerate the heat, or are there any other determining factors that you've also just noticed in your experience of why an athlete would be able to tolerate the heat better than others, or what might make them struggle? What's your thoughts on gender or any other factors?
Okay, I was expecting that to pop up. Okay, got to be careful on this one. I'll tell you now, there is research out there that does indicate that there is a difference between males and females. And it does suggest that the females, this is very individual. So not every female fits into this category. That there is suggestions that the females do not have the same sweat rate as males. Okay. And so we have what we call thermosensitivity can be different. So their level is lower than males. So they don't sweat to the same degree as males, so they don't get rid of heat quite as much. So the ability to tolerate heat can be slightly different than males. But in terms of how you train them, that it can be still the same. So protocols can still be the same. What you do is you factor that in. So the eyes, it might take that a little bit longer then for females to become a bit more accustomed to the heat than males. So I'm only putting a rough figure out. Just say it took 4 weeks to get a male to where you want them to be ready for a race. It might take females 6. So I'm not saying that's how long it's going to take, but I'm just saying, there could be a difference there depending on the athletes you're dealing with, the level they're at, whether they're a novice, intermediate, advanced, or elite. Okay, there are a lot of factors, but the general rule of thumb, there is a bit of a difference between the two.
Glenn, what would you say would be the best prep that you would do or you would advise for someone for a hot race who's coming from like a fairly cool race, or background, saying like I'm coming from England and I'm going to be racing in Kona? What would you say would be the ideal prep in terms of dealing with the heat and reaching like optimum performance? If you could use a mixture of like altitude and you could use a mixture of heat training, if you responded well to altitude, like I've been to altitude before and I seem to respond really well, and I struggle in the heat. So for someone with those characteristics, what would you say would be the optimum in terms of timing and how you would do things?
Okay, that's an interesting question. I'll put it to you this way. Which one do you think is going to have the big impact on race day? Your fitness or your ability to tolerate the heat?
I'd say fitness. Like I in the past, I feel like when I've been out in the heat, like I've done different time durations in Kona. Like I've been out for as long as like 4 or 5 weeks beforehand, and I've been as short as like 2 weeks. And I feel like if I spend too long there, my fitness actually decreases because I'm unable to do the sessions as well because of the temperature.
Okay.
I feel like I kind of get a bit more used to the heat from being out there for longer, but then my fitness is decreasing. So by the time I get to race day, if I went for say 4 or 5 weeks, I'm actually I'm less fit than what I was before, after 2 weeks of being there.
Yeah. So this is where you got to be careful, is that you probably find your adaptation, because you got to remember everything, you have a number of things that are changing. So you got sweat rate, heart rate and so forth, all the plasma volume. These are all changing at different rates. It takes about 4 to 6 days, about 75% of your adaptations to the heat have taken place. That's what the research tends to suggest to us. So you've been there for 4 or 5 weeks, can, by the sounds of yourself, you've indicated that it's too long, your training's starting to suffer, because what's happening is you're not recovering. Like I was saying before, you probably find you do a session, if you went out for a 5-hour ride in the heat, you come back, the body's going, whoa, we're taking too much time to recover here. And so by the time you get back up to do the next session, you're already still carrying forward fatigue from that session to the next one. So your performance or quality of that next session is dropping. So this is where it could be a case you don't need to have a long period of time in the heat, but a shorter period of time just to get used to the heat, but leave your fitness up. So it could be that you could benefit from, say, during your altitude, getting closer to the event to get yourself up there, but then get used to the heat in a short period of time. But yeah, you definitely want to make sure you got the heat done as close as you can, because you've got to remember. But the other thing to point out, I've got to point something else too. Heat, you can maintain heat adaptations for a period of time post coming out of the heat. So the idea is, again, you've got to think about when do you want to do which one, in which order you want to do them, in order to get the benefit from it based on your previous performances and how you've done it when you've done your altitude previously. So you know when you've done it previously versus when you've raced, how that's affected your performance. And then you go, okay, I've got to factor in heat. How can I put these two together? Well, which one then do you think you could put first and second to allow you to get to Kona in time? Does that make sense?
What is the optimum time to race after coming down from altitude? Because I've read that like red blood cells can survive for up to 3 months. So would you say that potentially if you race for like up to 2 months coming down from altitude, you've got just as big a gain? Or is it like you do need to race within 3 days? Because I've heard some people say you need to race within 3 days because from 3 to like 12 days you can feel quite fatigued and then you start feeling better again. Or what is that just totally individual? But is there a period where like red blood cells last for so long, so like it doesn't matter as long as you race within like 2 months?
Okay, you come up with some really tough questions.
Okay. Yeah, this is like we got him, Glenn.
Okay, but the problem I have is this is a so individual thing. So I can't honestly say it's going to be this three days or it's going to be 10 days or whatever. Because like I said, a lot of it's got to do with how high you've been and how long you've been there for. Okay, what you've done. There's a lot of variables that will determine how long effect you have. It's no different than the heat. How long you're in the heat and what protocol you've followed will determine how long that you have it. I'll jump to the heat for a side just to give an example. If you've been in the heat for a month, every day for a month and haven't missed, and you've been building up from, a 20-minute session through to a 2-hour session, when you stop, if you resume normal training in normal temperate conditions, you'll probably find you'll be able to maintain a lot of that, particularly if you're out there for 2 or 3 or 4 hours of solid training into the middle of the day, you'll maintain a lot of those adaptations for 2 weeks without any problem. So you can say, okay, I can stop my heat training 2 months in advance and still be very, very well affected because you're still going to be sweating quite well. You'll still be doing all that training into the heat because you're training in a temperate environment into the middle of the day. Altitude is something similar. It's not going to just suddenly, you stop day one, you come in from the altitude and you drop, and then within 2 days it's all gone. There's usually a decay rate. The problem we have with decay rates, we don't know as much about decay rates as we do about adaptations. That is the hiccup we have. Particularly with heat, we know a bit more about altitude, but it's very variable. I can't give you a definite answer without knowing what it is that you've done in terms of altitude, how long you've been there, and so forth.
One of the things you said then was about it depends on like the altitude. So how would it vary? Depend on the altitude. Would the effects last longer if you were able to cope with training at a higher altitude? And what is classed as like a moderate altitude in terms of like altitude training, and what's classed as like a high altitude in terms of altitude training?
Okay. Well, generally speaking, put it this way: if usually we get up around that 2,000 mark, right, is where most people consider that's where we've got to train. But if you start getting up around 3,000 above, you're not going to be able to train up there. Okay. So, because like if you think about, if you've ever done the Leadville Marathon, I don't know when anyone's done the Leadville Marathon.
No.
Okay. It starts at 3,000 meters, goes to 4,000 meters. So when you start, you're instantly sucking in the big ones because the air is so thin. And then all of a sudden you get to 4,000 and it's like, ooh, I really notice it's really light up here. And then you run back down. Okay. So, but if you try to train up there, then guess what? Your quality of training is going to be very, very poor. So you wouldn't be wanting to train up there. But if you were living up there, you can see how much impact it's going to have on your ability to do things because the air is so thin. Even just walking around, it's oh, geez, this is really tough. So it comes down to you've got to be practical. We know, for example, that living at altitude is better than training down low, so you can maintain that intensity. But yes, you can do some training sessions at high, but it comes down to how high can you go before you start to really notice it's going to affect your breathing. So my question to you is, what have you done with training before in terms of training at altitude?
So I've been to like Font Romeu a few times, like between 3 to 4 weeks, and that's at about 1,850 meters. And then I've also been to like Lake Tahoe, which is a bit higher. That's about 1,950 to 2,000 meters, and done like 3 weeks there. But even going to, I feel like I respond really well to altitude, so I don't need to go as high. Like I went to 2,000 meters before, and when I did that, it felt like it was like a bit too much. It actually felt like it was a bit detrimental. Whereas like 1,850, I've definitely improved. I've done some like blood like tests, afterwards as well, and like checked it, and I did get like a good stimulus from like being at 1850. So yeah, I mean that was quite a few years ago when I went to Lake Tahoe. I think that was like 7 years ago now. So, and I feel like every time I've gone to altitude, I've coped with it a lot better, quicker, if you know what I mean. Like the first time I went, it took me quite a long period of time, like a good 2 weeks before I started feeling good. Whereas the last time I went, it was literally like within 3 or 4 days, I felt back to my normal, almost like back to my normal self. I don't know if that's placebo effect or if that is a genuine effect or not, but I feel like I cope a lot quicker each time I go.
Okay. Well, I was going to say it can happen because you get used to what your body knows what to expect, and you know what to expect. So it's no different than heat. When you've done heat acclimation, you know, well, okay, body's going to tolerate this and how it's going to be, so you know what to expect. So it doesn't seem as bad. It's like when you've been to the gym and had a big break and you go back, it doesn't seem as bad the second time around as it did the first time you did it. So
do you produce more red blood cells at a higher elevation than what you would at a lower elevation if you were doing altitude training? Like regardless of not taking into account how you would cope with the training and all the negative impacts, just looking at it in purely a red blood cell production aspect, would you produce more?
Yeah, so typically if you're at 1,000 meters versus 3,000 meters, at 1,000 meters, the hyperbaric hypoxic level is negligible, so to speak. But if you're at 3,000, it's definitely noticeable. So body's going to respond more definitely there than it would at 1,000.
What about compared to like 2,000 and like say 2,500, something like that? Would there be more, or is your body like it can only produce so many at a certain rate that even going that bit higher is not going to make any difference once you get to a certain point?
Yeah. So it'll get to a point where the body does have a limit to what it's going to do. But the other thing is, putting the body under additional stress is not necessarily going to give you an additional benefit per se in performance, because you always got to remember it's the impact on performance. It's no different than the heat. Putting yourself on a 50-degree temperature is not more beneficial than 35 with 70% humidity, because you got to remember that the body's got to be able to cope with it. If you can only cope with it for 20 minutes because it's so darn hot, yeah, you're doing a lot of sweating, but the body's going, I just cannot handle this. I can't exercise at the right intensity. Then you're coming out there, what did you achieve? But if you're in the heat, say, for 2 hours at a solid temperature and a solid pace and sweating, you're getting so much more out of it than if you've gone the extreme. The altitude is the same. If you go overboard, then the body's trying to cope with going overboard than it is with, trying to adapt to what you've got in terms of doing exercise at the same time. So you've got to keep that take that into consideration as well.
Glenn,
like I say to a lot of endurance athletes, more is not always better. So don't think regardless of what it is that you're doing, it's more heat or more volume or more intensity is not always the answer when it comes to endurance training. It's quality versus quantity and how it's applied throughout your training schedule, and when it's applied, that's more important. And the problem we have then is everyone is so different because of our training experience, where we live, where we've adapted. And this is where we've got to start like taking notes. That's why I say to all my athletes, you got to keep a diary. What did you do? How did you do it? And when did you apply it? So we can look back and say, okay, last year when we get ready for Kona, we did X, Y, and Z. And we got improvements in our time trials. And when we got to Kona, we did really well. But when we did the next year, it didn't work as well. Let's go back. Let's change something else a little differently. That's how we do these
One thing I've seen with a lot of athletes is, and it's always like puzzled me a bit, is like I've seen like a lot of runners go to altitude in like, and even like some triathletes in like December to say Sierra Nevada, but there's no races until like April really when the season starts. And the only conclusion I could draw from it would be, is the reason you'd go for an altitude camp in say December so that you could train at a higher intensity because you've got more blood cells when you return in January, February, or March, and then you'd go back to altitude again. Would that be the reason behind it, or what would be the reason why some people would go to altitude in the off season when they're not racing for, like, say, 4 months time after that? Like, I've always wondered that.
Yeah, I was going to say that is there, because there's a variety of ways of doing periodization. And one of the methods you're describing there is what they sometimes will do is exactly that. They'll put intensity first. So the idea is they'll up their intensity, and then the idea is they'll start adding volume on. So the idea is that they will think, okay, well, I've got myself, fitter. Then the idea is I'll now start trying to keep that longer. So that could be what they're trying to achieve. I don't know exactly the ins and outs, exactly why they might be doing it, because everyone might be doing it for a variety of different reasons, but that could be one of the methods they're trying to use. Fitness first, and then we try to add on our volume that comes next to it, as opposed to the traditional method that a lot of people use, which is they do their volume first, then intensity comes second.
Have you got any questions, Nick?
Yeah, Glenn, when it comes to the potential benefits from altitude training, do they apply equally to athletes of all levels? So talking about newcomers to the sport and competing age groupers as well as professionals, or is it something you would say is more specific to a certain level of athlete?
Okay, that's a really good question. Generally speaking, I would advise people that altitude training is something you would look at once you've exhausted all your other methods of training first. Because what can happen is it could come a bit like people are thinking, well, altitude is like a magic pill. I'll get it done and it gives me a sudden boost and I'm off I go. But as I said earlier in the podcast, is that you've got to do your homework. So you've got to figure out, do all your basic training, whatever, and then figure out when should be applied, not using it as like a quick fix. If I'm short on something, then you try to apply this. It may work, but the reality is usually what's going to let you down is the fact you haven't done your other training. So my suggestion is, if it's heat letting you down, then train for the heat. If it's your fitness letting you down because you've tried everything else, but you just can't get, you might try to altitude on top of. But reality is, I would use it as the icing on the cake, but everything else has got to come first. You've got to do your volume, your intensity, your manipulations, your periodization as you normally would do, and also your skill level. So if you're a triathlete, for example, and you're still can't swim in a straight line in ocean water, then you need to practice. There's no point going and thinking, well, I'll get an improvement in altitude from the altitude. Well, it's not going to help you navigate any better. The same with your bike handling skills. If you don't know when to change gears or get around corners quickly, then improve those before you worry about doing VO2 max improvements.
I had one quick question as well. I'm sorry, it's a bit noisy now because we've just got Seychelles in our humid weather over here. We've got a big storm going on in the background. So we know that your heat adaptations work differently to altitude adaptations. And Glenn, don't worry, I've read all of your work. So I do listen to you and I know the answer to this, I think. But what about then if you went, okay, well, I'm going to get the best of both and I'm going to do some combination training. I'm just picturing Nick in his little altitude tent and then locking himself in the laundry with the dryer on. I'm kidding. What about if athletes went, well, they work in different ways. I'm going to really maximize my benefits. Say they're working on all of their endurance training, they're doing all those things right, and they're really trying to get those extra little percenters. Is there any merit in trying to work on both?
Okay, that's a good question. People have asked that question a number of years now, and there have been some research that has done that has combined of both and found that it's actually no benefit to having both versus if you just did heat by itself. Okay, and one of the reasons we've got to remember is that they actually can work against each other, because when you get altitude, typically altitude type of training can actually reduce plasma volume. Well, guess what heat's trying to do? Increase plasma volume. So you can actually work against each other there. So if they're working against each other, then who's going to win? You can end up with an equilibrium. So it could be the case of what you gained here, you end up counteracting it there. So you end up back at where you started type of thing. The reality is they've found that when you combine the two, it actually gives you the same benefits as if you just did heat by itself, if you're going into a hot environment or into a thermoneutral environment. But I'm tipping you'll find that there's people are doing research that will find that, yes, you can do altitude and it'll give you a benefit over heat. it'll come back to what variables have been changed and how long they've done it for and things like that. But from what I've seen so far is that there's not a lot of evidence to show that you put the two together, you get a whammy to get bang, both up there on top of above doing one by themselves. No, it's not there.
If you coach someone, Glenn, would you recommend them to get an altitude tent then if they couldn't get to altitude very easily? Like, what would be your opinions then on that, your final kind of thing? Like,
okay, my final thing is I put it this way, most endurance sports are done in heat, and most of them are actually environments where most people aren't used to. So whether you're doing the 6-day run in Morocco or you're doing a Kona, how many people live in these environments? So compared to the populations that do live there and train there, there's very few. So you probably find 75% of the population have to train for the heat. So I personally would ask people to train in heat as opposed to altitude, is our own personal preference. Because when I've seen people that have traveled from, like when they do the Cairns Ironman, even though it's in winter for us, the amount of people that are suffering, and I don't believe you'd find that the altitude is going to help them as much as the heat acclimation would.
Glenn's just trying to save a lot of marriages with that answer. He's trying to keep a lot of wives happy with not having an altitude tent over.
Yeah, so don't get me wrong, altitude has its place. Don't get me wrong, I'm not saying it doesn't, but I believe you'd probably find most athletes are underestimating the impact that their environment is going to have on their performance. Because when you start looking at people going along and they're drinking and dousing themselves and they're just plodding along, that's not fitness. Because if you analyze the performances in most Ironmans in the run, right? If you've got people that are doing an Olympic marathon, an Olympic distance event, and they are running 40 minutes or less for their event in the run, in theory, there's no reason why they can't do a sub 3:30 marathon. They've got the fitness there. Their VO2 should be high enough to be able to do that. The reason why they don't, most of them are doing 4.5, even 5 hours, is purely because of two factors: fatigue and dealing with things like heat.
what about at the elite side of the things, though, where the margins are so small nowadays and people are being able to cope with the heat? What would it change then? So, say you go into Frankfurt, it's a big European race. It could only be like 18, 20 degrees. The heat might not be a massive factor. And the difference between running 2-3 minutes could be like five positions, really. Would that change it a bit more then? So you'd say, actually, the margins are a bit smaller here. Altitude could be the difference between getting a good result. Whereas, like you said, in Cairns, if you run 3:45 because you can't cope in the heat and you're capable of running 3:15, then actually being a bit more used to heat is more likely to make a massive difference rather than like a few minutes from going to altitude.
Totally agree.
Yeah.
So you're quite right. So if you're in an environment like you were saying about Frank, I wouldn't worry about heat training then. I'd go the other side and go, okay, let's try altitude. But you just got to figure out then exactly when it's going to fall and how much. And like I said, you wouldn't wait to Frankfurt to try it out. You do it in your practice events. You'd figure out 2 or 3 practice events, and you try a slightly different protocol for each one to figure out what it is that gives you the best result. Because it's probably, if you've probably got an idea already what works, but then just vary it slightly to say, okay, I varied it by this much and I got an extra 5%. Whoa, that's a phenomenal improvement. But I tried the next one and I didn't get any improvement at all. Okay, well, I actually went backwards. Well, then you're okay. If everything else stayed the same, then you know that that's the protocol you should be trying for Frankfurt, say. And that's where you'd go.
I have one question before we'll wrap it up, because I know we've taken a lot of your time already and this has been incredibly helpful, Glenn. I wanted to ask almost the inverse, which I guess would be Nick and I's situation. So we're training where it's, what's the humidity, 80%?
Probably, yeah.
It's about 80% every day. It's between 30 to 32 degrees every day. It's just hot and gross all the time. Yeah. But we're doing Dubai Marathon where it's going to be 10 to 20-ish degrees. Would you warrant what Joe was sort of touching on and his sort of thoughts on us actually doing some treadmill and some cooler sessions? So for people, who, even Australians, like say, Glenn, some of your athletes in Cairns or some athletes where it's just really hot, and then say they go and do Berlin marathon, or where it's 6 to 9 degrees, or in that situation, would you say to them, do you know what, go and find yourself a real aircon room with a fan and do some cooler sessions, or is that not worth it?
Definitely. People underestimate how much the impact of the environment has, whether it's hot, cold, temperate, or whatever it has. So just give you an example, when I've gone down to Port Macquarie to do the Ironman, and we had one year where we started the swim and it was 8 or 9 degrees, and then it rained when it came out, so you didn't warm up. And because I was from Cairns, it was like I was wearing arm warmers and a rain jacket for the whole 180 k's and never warmed up. The time was ridiculously slow because I couldn't feel my feet; they were frozen. So the reality is, it's a case of I was so acclimatized to the heat, even though I just train in it all the time. Even though the event was in May down there, which for the people down there, they thought, oh, this is great, it's nice and cool. To me, it was freezing because the top temperature only got 12 or 13 degrees. But how do I acclimatize for that up here? I can't. The water temperature in the ocean never gets below 28 degrees or something ridiculous. So the idea is the pool's just always hot, and it was just so hard to get used to cold temperatures. Unless I sit on the indoor train with the air conditioning and the hose going the whole time, I was never going to get used to that temperature. So I just did a really slow time. So yes, you're quite right. You need to get used to your environment. So if you are living in the Seychelles and you're going to do a run that's going to be in 10 degrees, then you need to practice air conditioning, treadmills, go for it.
Yeah, the power bill is going to be expensive.
I've just got one last question, what I just thought of, because we've been talking, like you said, a lot about like actual the heat training, but like, what is the best method to cool yourself down in a hot race? Like when you get ice and stuff like that, like what would you say? So say like I'm going to Kona and I'm like, Glenn, I'm terrible in the heat. I've done my heat prep and everything, but I'm still dying. What can I use during the race that could help me keep my core body temperature down a bit?
Okay. Unfortunately, there's no magic way of doing this, because typically what happens is the core temperature on the inside is rising because you got kind of like a conflict between the body going, well, body temperature is rising. We're going to get blood to the working muscles, and we're going to get the blood to take the heat from the core to the periphery. So it's going, which one do I need to do? And you're going, got to run faster, got to cycle faster. And so theoretically, you can override the cooling mechanism and put the effort into generating more power. But the problem we have is we get hotter. So you need to do a few things. You need to make sure that you keep fluid intake, and the cooler the fluid coming in, the better off you'll be. Up to a point, you don't want it to be like 3 or 4 degrees. It'll be too cold, and when it hits you, it'll be so cold you go, oh, that really gives you a cramp and so forth. But you need cool water coming in. I realize when you're in Kona, quite often the water they give you quite often is in a bottle, and it's been sitting in the sun. It's the same temperature as the environment virtually, but as much liquid as you can drink, keep it coming through. Secondly, keep yourself cool. The more evaporation that takes place, the better off you'll be. The problem you have in Kona is that conductivity to the environment and radiation to the environment from you, because the environment's so hot, it's hotter than you, is going to be limited. So the only thing that you can do is evaporation. So the reality is you just need to make sure that you're keeping yourself as cool by, putting water over your head, those type of ice into your cap. So wear a cap. That's the other thing is too, you want to keep the sun off your face. Do you normally run with a hat on?
No, not normally, because I found like the hat felt like it was getting my head warmer, but I don't know. Is it worthwhile putting the hat cap on? Would that like actually be more beneficial then?
Yeah, so I was going to say two things that happen. Most people quite often perceive themselves getting hotter because their face is getting hot. So when you put a cap on, it takes the heat off the face. You can actually, oh, that feels better. And the other thing to do then is what you do quite often is put ice into the hat, put it on your head, and it feels, oh, that feels nice and refreshing. And as it drips down, it gives you that nice, cool, refreshing.
That was what I did last time. Because I thought the only reason I put the cap on was to like put the ice in it, because I thought it will like melt and then like cool my head down. But like that was what I thought was like the only benefit really from it. But is there also any ice that you can put in it, hold it in any particular areas that you think would be like good for cooling? Like, if you grab some ice at an aid station, or does it not really matter?
I was going to say, you put it this way, you got to be careful too. You don't want to be carrying the more weight that you take with you, the slower, the more you're going to notice that you suddenly put a a kilo of ice on, you go, whoa,
Yeah.
I can feel that. So you've got to be careful. The other thing to think about is the wetter you become, you've also got to think about chafing and so forth. So you've got to make sure you're used to your clothes being soaking wet.
Yeah.
Because the other thing is when they're cold, they'll also become sticky. So the skin context changes when the skin becomes cool. So if you've got ice, this is again where you're going to have to practice before race day, before you get to Kona's day at race. Oh, I'm going to have to put ice in my cap for the very first time and go, whoa, I've got a brain freeze. You need to make sure you know what it feels like, and as well as whatever it is you're going to wear on race day, because the skin will feel different and the clothes will feel different. So you can get chafing and things like that. But the other thing is too, you can't really put ice anywhere else. You can put like your cool bands around your neck, which make you feel nice and cool. But in terms of physiology of cooling it down, they don't have a massive impact because you're generating so much heat. But they do make you feel that little bit cool.
So do you think a lot of it is more like the placebo effect when you put ice in certain areas rather than the actual physiological change within your body?
Yeah, well, you got to remember is that like the most effective way to cool a body down is immersion, because it's phenomenal how conductivity of water is compared to air. So if you get into like an ice bath, like a 15 degrees, it just absorbs the heat out of the body. So you can take someone who's literally overheated and put them into water, and that takes that heat out. And within a matter of 5-10 minutes, you've got them birching back to normal. It's that effective. You can't do that when you're out running. You just can't do it. It's just not possible. So the idea is you can't put anything on that's going to take all that heat away from you. You can only put things on that are going to make you feel, oh, that was refreshing for that 1 or 2 minutes that you still got the cooling there.
Yeah.
The closer you can get is the ice into the hat, okay, and keeping the fluid up. Cool fluid coming in and putting the water over you, so the more the evaporation can take off you, the cooler you will be. So you have to rely on evaporation in places like Kona. You don't have much choice.
Amazing. Well, Glen, thank you so much for your valuable insight. This has been incredible, and I know that our listeners are going to really, really appreciate this. I think that Joe might owe you a drink if he does really well in Kona next time or in his hot races. He's definitely got some really good tips there. So
absolutely, I think we've all taken away something personally that we can learn as well.
It's been so interesting. I always find my face is the one thing that gets hot. I splash it, I cool down, I notice my pace go up, it goes hot. And I've been running without a hat, but now that hat is going on. That is definitely going on.
A lot of people say to me, because I always run with a hat, and they go, why do you run the hat? And I'm going, well, you'll tell the difference when you don't and you live in a place like Cairns, and that burning sensation on your face, it knocks you around. So you get used to running with a hat on, and it does make a difference. So when you don't have it on, you can tell you're not running properly. So, the other thing I was just going to say is, I realize in this chat we've had today, I haven't given a lot of specific information. And one of the reasons being is because when you work in the heat, outdoor environment, you really need to make sure that you understand the athletes that you're working with, or if you're the athlete or the person that you're trying to figure it out for. It's everyone's individual. We're so different in terms of ability to tolerate things, adapt to things. It's not one case fits all. So when we give, write articles and that, they're guidelines only. So people have got to take it in context of that. And you've got to do your own homework, because we all handle things differently.
Well, that was perfect, because I was about to say, is there anything you want to summarize to add in? And I think that is perfect take home. Thank you so much for your time, Glen. We really appreciate it. And I'm sure that we'll have you back on here again at some stage to chat about even more aspects of endurance training. So thank you very much.
Yeah, thanks, Glen.
Thank you. All right, thanks, Joe.
Thank you.